The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when I got home from work, and I almost threw it in the recycling pile without opening it. It looked like junk mail, plain white, no return address printed on the front, but something made me stop. My name, Nadia, written in my grandmother's handwriting. Shaky, slanted a little to the right the way it always did when her arthritis was bad. She'd been gone for 4 months. I stood in my coat, still holding my bag, and opened it right there. Inside was a single folded letter and a business card from a law firm in Portland. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs. I read it twice before I sat down on the floor. Grandma had left me the house. Not the lake cabin everyone always talked about. Not the jewelry or the china or any of the things my stepmother had already started quietly redistributing among herself and her kids after the funeral. The house. The 4-bedroom colonial on Hartwell Street that my father had grown up in. That I had grown up in summers. That my stepmother had been living in, rent-free, for the past 6 years. My grandmother had put it in a trust 3 years before she died, quietly, without telling anyone. I called the number on the business card right there on the kitchen floor, still in my coat. My father remarried when I was 11. My mother had died the year before, breast cancer, fast and cruel, and my father met my stepmother at a grief support group 8 months later. I know how that sounds. I know. She had 2 kids of her own, a daughter, Melissa, who was 13 and had the kind of confidence that read as cruelty, and a son, Drew, who was 16 and mostly just lived through me like I was part of the furniture. My father was still so deep in his grief that I think he genuinely didn't see what was happening. How Melissa started borrowing things from my room without asking and then acted offended when I mentioned it. How my stepmother would cook dinner for 4 and then act surprised when I came downstairs, like she just remembered I existed. How Drew would use my laptop and leave it dead on the counter. Small things. None of them screamed abuse. None of them were the kind of thing you could bring to your dad without sounding petty. So I stopped bringing things to my dad. What I did instead was spend summers with my grandmother. She lived alone in the big house on Hartwell Street after my grandfather died. She'd rattle around in it, she said, but she didn't want to sell it. She'd grown a garden in the back that took up half the yard. She made biscuits from scratch every Sunday. She taught me to play gin rummy, and she beat me every single time, and she never once let me win on purpose because she said that was disrespectful. She also watched everything. She had the kind of quiet attention that most people mistake for passivity. She wasn't passive, she was just gathering information. "You stepmother," she said to me once, the summer I was 16, while we were shelling beans on the back porch. She didn't finish the sentence. She just said those 2 words and looked out at the garden. "She's fine," I said, because I didn't know how else to answer. My grandmother shelled beans in silence for a while. Then she said, "You don't have to protect people who aren't protecting you." I didn't know what to do with that at 16. I filed it away. After college, I moved to Seattle for a job in healthcare administration. I was 23, making decent money for the first time in my life. And I finally had enough distance from my stepmother's house to breathe. I had a small apartment I loved. I had friends who knew me as just Nadia, not your dad's daughter from his first marriage. I came home for Thanksgiving. I came home for Christmas. I kept things cordial. My stepmother had moved into the Hartwell Street house 2 years after they married, slowly migrating her furniture and her habits and her taste into every corner of it. My grandmother was still alive then, still sharp, still watching. She'd said to my stepmother once when my stepmother started talking about updating the kitchen, that the kitchen was exactly as she intended it to be. After my grandfather died and then my grandmother's health started going, my father made the decision, a decision I was not consulted on, to move my stepmother in full time to help care for her. My grandmother had agreed to this, or at least she hadn't fought it out loud. What I didn't know then, and only found out later from the attorney, was that she'd walked into that law office the following week and quietly restructured everything. My grandmother was many things. She was not passive. The Thanksgiving I want to tell you about happened last year, 14 months after my grandmother died. My stepmother had settled into Hartwell Street like she'd always lived there. She'd repainted the living room a gray that swallowed all the light. She'd taken down the photographs my grandmother kept on the hall table, The ones of my grandfather, my father as a boy, me at various ages, and replaced them with a gallery wall of prints she'd bought at Home Goods. She'd converted the back bedroom into a home office for Drew, who was 32 and had moved back in after a breakup and showed no signs of leaving. Melissa came in from Phoenix with her husband and their 2 kids for the holiday. She drove a car I couldn't afford. She wore a coat I definitely couldn't afford. She walked through the front door of my grandmother's house and said, "I love what Mom's done with this place," and my stepmother beamed. I had driven down from Seattle, 7 hours. I told myself every year that I did it for my father, and every year I had to remind myself of that harder and harder. The house smelled like it always did, something under the new paint and my stepmother's candles, old wood, and something I could never quite name. Staying. Memory. I had arrived in the afternoon and I'd gone to the kitchen to offer to help, because that's what I did, because that was the groove I'd been worn into since I was 11 years old. My stepmother handed me a list without looking up from her phone. Potatoes to peel, a pie crust to roll out, table settings for 11 people. I did it. I told myself I didn't mind. By the time everyone arrived that evening, I had been in the kitchen for 3 hours. My stepmother had changed into a blouse and was in the living room with a glass of wine. Melissa was on the couch. Drew was somewhere in the back. My father came and found me in the kitchen. He looked tired. He always looked tired now. "You should come join everyone," he said. "I'm finishing the gravy," I said. "You stepmother can." "It's fine, Dad. Go sit down." He went and sat down. I told myself that was a choice I made freely. I'm not sure I believed it even then. Dinner was loud the way big family dinners are loud. My stepmother sat at the head of the table. My father sat at the other end. Melissa's kids were between them and kept knocking things over. Drew had brought a woman no one had met, younger, quiet, looked like she was doing math in her head, trying to figure out if she should leave. I sat near the middle. Melissa's husband, I'll call him what he was, which was a man who thought being loud was the same as being interesting, was talking about a business trip he'd taken to Austin. He'd been talking about it for about 10 minutes without anyone asking follow-up questions. Then there was a lull, the kind that happens when someone has finally paused long enough for the rest of the table to surface. Melissa's older kid, who was 7 and still learning social calibration, asked where the good rolls were, the ones from earlier. "Nadia made those," my father said. Melissa's husband looked at me, not unkindly, exactly, just the way you look at someone you filed in a particular category. "Oh right, Nadia, you work in healthcare, right? Like nursing?" "Healthcare administration," I said. "Oh, okay, cool." And then Melissa, this is the part I want you to understand. This is the sentence I've turned over in my head probably 200 times since. Melissa said it. Casually, not even cruelly, which somehow made it worse. She said it to her husband like I wasn't sitting 8 feet away. She said, "She basically keeps the house running when she visits. Cooks, cleans, all of it. I told Mom she should start paying her." Then she laughed. Her husband laughed. My stepmother smiled into her wine glass. My father looked at his plate. The woman Drew had brought looked out the window. I sat very still. I had a fork full of green beans halfway to my mouth and I set it down very carefully on the edge of my plate. I could feel my face doing something. I didn't know exactly what. I pressed my hands flat on my thighs under the table. "Actually," I said, my voice came out even. I surprised myself. "That's an interesting way to think about it." Nobody said anything. "Given that it's my house," I said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. My stepmother set down her wine glass. Melissa's face went through several expressions quickly. My father looked up. "What?" my stepmother said. I had not planned to say it then. I want to be honest about that. I had spent the 8 weeks since talking to the attorney deciding carefully how to handle this. I had a meeting scheduled with my own attorney for December 3rd. I had intended to be measured. I had intended to be a grown adult who handled things properly and calmly and through appropriate legal channels. But I had been in that kitchen for 3 hours. and I had been coming home for 15 years and feeling like a guest in a house full of photographs I'd been cropped out of. And Melissa had just suggested that someone should pay me to exist in my own grandmother's house. So I said it. My grandmother left me the house, I said. It went into a trust in 2021. I'd been in contact with her attorney since October. Technically, everyone at this table has been living here or enjoying this property without a lease or any formal arrangement. My stepmother stood up. She didn't do it dramatically. It was almost involuntary, like a reflex. Like her body moved before her brain caught up. That's not, she stopped. Started again. Your father and I aren't on the title, I said. I checked. My father asked everyone to give us a moment, and to their credit, most of the table found somewhere else to be fairly quickly. Melissa lingered in the doorway until her husband pulled her by the sleeve. What followed was not a clean conversation. I don't want to make it sound like a movie. My stepmother cried, which I hadn't expected, and I'm not sure the tears were entirely strategic. I think some of it was real shock. My father was quiet for a long time in a way that wasn't anger. It was closer to grief, actually, the look of a man realizing several things at once. Why didn't she tell me? He said, not to me, just out loud. I think she was protecting herself, I said, and me. He didn't argue with that. My stepmother had a lot of questions I didn't have answers to yet. Timelines. What this meant practically. I told her I had an attorney. I told her everything would go through proper channels. I told her nothing was happening that night. She said, "We've put 6 years into this house." I thought about the gray paint, the home goods gallery wall, my grandmother's photographs in a box in the attic that I had found the previous summer and quietly moved to my car. I know, I said, and I meant it neutrally. December 3rd, I met with my attorney, a woman named, well, she was thorough and direct and didn't waste my time, which is all I needed. What followed over the next 3 months was not a battle exactly. It was closer to a slow, uncomfortable exhale. My father and stepmother had no legal claim to the property. There was no mortgage. My grandmother had paid it off in 2009. There was no lease, no informal rental agreement, nothing in writing. The trust was airtight. My attorney sent a formal notice in January. Not an eviction notice. Nothing so dramatic. A notice of ownership and a request to discuss terms for a transition. I gave them 6 months. I could have given them 30 days. I gave them 6 months because my father was in that house too, and because I wasn't doing this to hurt him, and because I wanted to be the kind of person my grandmother believed I was when she wrote my name in that trust. Melissa called me twice. The first call I let go to voicemail. She said I was tearing the family apart. I thought about that word family and what it had meant in practice in that house for the past 15 years. The second call I answered. She said she hoped I understood what I was doing. I said I did. She said, "You always acted like you were better than us." I said, "I never acted like anything. I peeled the potatoes." She hung up. Drew moved out in February. He'd gotten a job offer in Denver, which, as my father pointed out with a kind of exhausted relief, had been in the works for a while anyway. The woman from Thanksgiving had apparently declined a second date, which I found out incidentally and felt nothing about either way. My stepmother called me in March. Not to negotiate, her attorney handled that. She called me personally on a Sunday afternoon, and I almost didn't pick up. She said, "I need you to know that I never thought of you as the help." I sat with that for a second. "Melissa was joking," she said. "I know she thought it was a joke," I said. A long pause. "I tried to include you," she said. And the thing was, I could hear that she believed this. That was the strange part. She had constructed a version of the past 15 years in which she had been trying, and the gap between that version and the one I'd lived in was so wide I didn't know how to cross it in a phone call. "I know you did," I said, because it was the closest true thing I could offer. We didn't say much after that. My father and stepmother moved to a rental house in the same town in April. A nice one, 3 bedrooms, good school district for Melissa's kids when they visited, a yard. My father seemed, when I saw him for his birthday in May, like a man who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had set it down and wasn't entirely sure how he felt about the lightness. He hugged me for a long time at his birthday dinner. He said, "She always loved you best, you know." I said, "She loved you too." He said, "I know, but it was different with you." I didn't answer that. I just held on to him for a second longer. I moved into the house on Hartwell Street in June. The first thing I did was repaint the living room, not the original color. I didn't know exactly what that had been. But something warmer, something that let the light in. I found the box of photographs in my car where I'd stashed them the previous summer. I sat on the living room floor and went through all of them. My grandfather in his army uniform. My grandmother at what looked like a state fair, laughing at something off camera. My father at maybe 8 or 9, gap-toothed and squinting at the sun. Me at 4, at 7, at 12, held in my grandmother's arms or standing next to her in the garden. I hung them back in the hall. There was something else in the box I hadn't noticed before, a small envelope tucked into the corner, sealed with a strip of tape that had yellowed at the edges. My name on the front in that same slanted handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a note card, 4 sentences. "I watched you for 30 years. I know exactly who you are. The house knows too. Take care of the garden." I read it twice. Then I went to the back window and looked out at the garden, which had gone wild and a little leggy in the months no one had been tending it. I could see the bones of what she'd built out there, though. The structure of it. All the things still growing underneath. I went to find my gardening gloves. I still think about that moment in the kitchen, the gravy on the stove, my hands smelling like onion and butter, everyone else already on their second glass of wine. I wasn't angry then. I was just tired in a way that had accumulated over 15 years without me fully noticing, the way sediment builds at the bottom of something that looks clear on the surface. My grandmother noticed, though, she always did. What I've come to understand, slowly and not without some resistance, is that the people who end up okay are usually not the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who kept going quietly when it would have been easier to stop. I peeled those potatoes. I drove 7 hours. I showed up year after year to a table where I was more or less invisible, and I didn't do it because I was weak. I did it because I had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was going to be the kind of person who didn't let other people's smallness determine my behavior. That's not a virtue you're born with. It's something you build by choosing it over and over in small moments nobody's watching. My grandmother built it that way too. She didn't make noise about what she was doing with the house. She didn't call me and say, "I see what's happening and I'm going to fix it." She walked into a law office and did something deliberate and quiet and smart, and then she waited. That kind of thinking, clear-eyed, patient, grounded in reality rather than emotion, doesn't come from being the smartest person in the room. It comes from paying attention for a long time and trusting what you see. I think about Melissa's phone call sometimes. How she said I always acted like I was better than them. I wasn't, and I'm not. But I did believe, even at 11 years old, with no real reason to, that I was going to be all right eventually. That belief didn't come from certainty. It came from something stubborner than that, a refusal to fully accept the version of myself that other people were trying to hand me. The house on Hartwell Street is mine now. The garden is coming back. I repotted 3 of my grandmother's rose bushes last month and 2 of them are already showing new growth. Things that look dead sometimes aren't. They're just waiting for someone to tend to them again. I gave my father and stepmother 6 months to move because that's what felt right to me, not because anyone told me to, not because I was calculating how it would look. I did it because I'd spent a long time watching what happened when people acted purely out of reaction, out of hurt, out of the need to make someone else feel as small as they'd made you feel. It doesn't work. It just makes more wreckage for everyone to step around. What I wanted was the house. What I wanted was to put those photographs back on the hall table. What I wanted was to stand in my grandmother's kitchen and make something from scratch, and not owe anyone an explanation for why I was there. I have all of that now. The no-tie card is on my refrigerator. Take care of the garden. I'm trying.